Water is pouring into my basement. You did this. I'm calling the city. Karen, you flooded my house. You should have fixed your foundation. This is all your fault. So there I am, 2 a.m., ankle deep in freezing water, while Karen next door is shrieking loud enough to set off car alarms. Hit like if you've ever been blamed for someone else's disaster. Subscribe for more stories where entitled neighbors take pettiness to Olympic levels. Get comfy, because this isn't just water under the bridge. Ever wondered what happens when an HOA Karen creates a flood and picks a fight with the wrong neighbor? Let's just say she had no idea that karma was already bubbling up from below. It was one of those nights where the house just feels different, air thick, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you listen for things that aren't there. Around 2 in the morning, my phone vibrated with one of those emergency alerts. Flash flood warning. Seek higher ground. I would have rolled over and gone back to sleep, except I could hear my dog losing his mind at the basement door, barking like the world was ending. Bleary-eyed and dragging my feet, I shuffled toward the stairs, already mentally preparing for another one of Karen's midnight security patrols, or maybe just a lost raccoon in the trash cans. Instead, the second I opened the basement door, a cold, damp gust hit me full in the face. The smell alone, muddy, chemical, sharp, told me this was more than a leaky pipe. As soon as I flicked the lights on, it was undeniable. Water. Not just a puddle, but a spreading, shimmering pool stretching from the far wall and creeping steadily toward the boxes stacked in the corner. My dog barked again, ears pinned back, and I squished down the steps in my ridiculous yellow slippers, already feeling cold water soak into my toes. I grabbed the first thing in reach, an old salad bowl from the camping gear bin, and started scooping, but it was hopeless. The water just kept coming, slipping through the cracks at the shared wall like it had somewhere to be, like it had a mission and zero patience for whatever plans I had for sleep. I could hear the faint sound of Karen's voice echoing from somewhere outside, sharp, slicing through the night. Of course, because when disaster strikes in this neighborhood, it's never just a disaster, it's always an audience. While I'm trying to keep my comic books and half my childhood out of harm's way, Karen's already on the phone, her voice going up an octave as she launches into a diatribe about community standards and water damage that is clearly the result of my neglect. I can't even get a word in. Somewhere above me, her porch light flickers on. I see her silhouette in the window, hair in rollers, phone in hand, narrating my misfortune to whoever will listen, the queen of midnight disasters. All I can think is, only in this neighborhood would someone turn your flood into a spectator sport. By the time the adrenaline wore off and the reality of the situation set in, I was ankle deep in freezing water and running out of things to bail with. The salad bowl had cracked, the mop was a joke, and the towels were soaked and useless. Upstairs, my phone buzzed nonstop with notifications from the neighborhood group chat. Karen, it seemed, had already begun her damage control tour, but not the kind that helps anyone. Her message popped up in all caps. Urgent. Flood. At 218. Possible water code violation. Resident may have caused subsurface damage. For someone who claimed to hate drama, she sure loved being at the center of it. I tried to call a plumber, but the first 2 numbers went straight to voicemail. The third one picked up and promised to send someone when the sun comes up, or sooner if you can pay overtime. As I paced my sodden basement, I could hear Karen's voice drifting through the vent above the laundry room. She was out there, probably wearing her finest rain poncho and slippers, documenting everything on her tablet for the HOA archives. Every few minutes, she'd stop to shout instructions at no one in particular, as if she'd been elected neighborhood flood marshal. By the time I made it outside, hoping to get a sense of just how bad it was, I found Karen standing at the edge of our property line with a flashlight and a measuring tape, her phone camera pointed directly at the little river of water, streaming from her side yard into mine. "This is clear evidence," she was saying, voice tight with self-righteous glee, "of negligent property maintenance." I asked her, calmly as I could manage, if she'd checked her own backyard yet. She replied that she didn't need to, because according to her, her side had never had water issues before I moved in. The moonlight caught the steady drip of water pouring down from her newly installed gutter extension. The one she had insisted last month was up to code. Now, water was pouring off her patio and straight through a channel she'd dug for landscaping improvements, running directly toward my foundation. She snapped another photo for posterity, lips pressed tight, narrating every second for her audience. Meanwhile, my basement kept filling. As I looked at the mess spreading through my house, I realized that the only thing multiplying faster than the water was the list of ways Karen would try to pin this on me. 20 minutes into this mess, the whole situation started to feel less like a normal emergency and more like a scene from one of those reality shows where everything just keeps getting worse. My arms ached from scooping water, and every new splash sounded like a ticking clock. Just as I tried to stack some boxes out of the danger zone, I caught another glimpse of Karen outside. This time, she was standing under her porch light, arms crossed, robe cinched tight, acting like a royal sentry. It was obvious she'd made herself the main character in whatever story she was live blogging for the HOA. I could hear her narrating, every sentence peppered with phrases like potential lawsuit and community standards, as if she'd already drawn up a court order. When the plumber finally arrived, he looked like he'd stepped out of bed and straight into his boots. He surveyed the basement, eyebrows raised. "That's coming from next door," he said, nodding toward the wall that separated my house from Karen's. I followed him outside, where he crouched by the side of the house, shining his flashlight along the row of bricks and the small trench Karen had insisted on calling drainage optimization. The water wasn't just trickling, it was streaming straight through the dirt, under the fence, and pooling at my foundation before leaking into the basement. Karen stormed over, bristling with righteous fury, still clutching her phone like a badge. She demanded to know why the plumber was on my property at such an hour, and insisted that if anyone had caused damage, it was surely me, since her landscaping was professionally designed and approved by several experts. The plumber didn't even bother looking up. He just pointed at the roaring little stream and said, "Ma'am, your gutter extension is dumping water straight into his foundation. That's the problem." For a moment, Karen looked genuinely shocked, as if no one had ever suggested her improvements could possibly be flawed. She recovered quickly, snapping another photo for her digital scrapbook and insisting it was defamation for anyone to blame her. She then announced that she would be contacting her own preferred contractor to dispute the findings. As the plumber continued his inspection, she paced along the fence line, narrating every step, making sure to keep the camera pointed at my yard. Meanwhile, I realized I'd need more than just a plumber to get out of this mess. I'd need a miracle, or at the very least, someone who could outtalk Karen. By sunrise, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones, but Karen's performance was just getting started. Instead of quietly assessing the mess or maybe even apologizing, she went into full PR mode. Her latest tactic was posting frantic updates across every social media and community app she could find. Nextdoor, Facebook, even a neighborhood watch WhatsApp group that nobody had used since the great mailbox theft of 2017. Each post was a carefully crafted novella of victimhood, painting herself as the only reasonable person fighting against wanton neglect and unneighborly conduct. According to her, I had willfully ignored years of obvious foundation risk factors and had sabotaged my own property to make her look bad. As I sipped my third cup of bitter instant coffee, my phone pinged with screenshots from neighbors. The group chat had become a running commentary on Karen's flood saga. Some messages were sympathetic, but most just sent me memes and GIFs, usually featuring sinking ships or Noah's Ark. Outside, her yard looked like an accidental koi pond, water covering half the grass. Karen, however, strutted around her driveway with a clipboard, making exaggerated notes as she paced along the property line. She kept glancing at my windows, making sure I saw her documenting evidence. Her strategy wasn't to solve anything. It was to collect a paper trail thick enough to bury any inconvenient facts. At one point, she caught me looking and yelled across the fence that I should start budgeting for attorney fees. She then whipped out her phone and filmed the puddles in my backyard, carefully avoiding the spot where her gutter extension emptied directly into the channel she'd dug. When a few neighbors dared to wander outside, Karen cornered them with a dramatic retelling of her sleepless night, emphasizing how irresponsible property management by yours truly had endangered the entire block. Most of them nodded politely, offering the kind of tight-lipped sympathy reserved for people you hope will walk away soon. But not everyone was buying her story. A couple of longtime residents gave me discreet thumbs-ups or mouthed, "Hang in there," as Karen continued her sidewalk soliloquy. Meanwhile, water was still trickling into my basement, and I was still alone cleaning up the damage. Through it all, Karen remained committed to her narrative, convinced that if she said it loudly enough, it would magically become the truth. I watched her circle the street, and for the first time, I understood this was never about the water. For Karen, the flood was just a stage, and I was her unwilling co-star. By late morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Word spread fast that the HOA president had called an emergency meeting, but nobody seemed entirely sure why it had to be in my front yard, right next to the mud and scattered buckets. Karen showed up first, clutching a canvas tote stuffed with files, her rain boots sloshing through the grass with every purposeful step. She took her place near my mailbox like she was leading a parade, waving at each neighbor as they approached. Most people arrived carrying coffee or curiosity, trying not to slip in the mess while glancing warily at the growing puddle creeping toward the sidewalk. The president, Mr. Collins, tried to bring some order to the chaos. He set up a folding chair, balanced a clipboard on his knee, and called the meeting to order. Karen wasted no time launching into her speech. She began with a dramatic sigh, declared the flood a community catastrophe, and insisted that my alleged carelessness had jeopardized everyone's property values. She held up a stack of printed screenshots, waving them in the air like evidence at a trial. The pages fluttered to the ground as she described her sleepless night and how her own quick thinking had contained the disaster. As she spoke, a few of the older neighbors exchanged glances, trying to hide their amusement. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, whispered something about popcorn and settled onto her porch steps for a better view. Karen continued, her voice rising with every sentence, painting herself as both the hero and the victim. The HOA board members looked back and forth between Karen and the mud, visibly torn between politeness and the urge to escape before someone handed them a mop. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I explained that the plumber had traced the water's source to Karen's side of the fence, and that her new gutter installation seemed to be redirecting half the neighborhood's rain into my basement. Karen cut me off, accusing me of slander and threatening to call her lawyer if I didn't retract my statement. The president raised his hands for quiet, but Karen was already pulling out more photos, each one less convincing than the last. By the end of the meeting, nothing was solved, but everyone had an opinion and a story to tell. Karen left in a huff, declaring she would escalate things to the city. The crowd dispersed, most shaking their heads, a few sending me sympathetic glances. My yard was left muddy and trampled, but at least for a moment, the attention shifted away from the flood and landed squarely on the spectacle of Karen's performance. Not long after the emergency HOA meeting ended, Karen returned to the scene with renewed energy and a plastic binder so heavy it looked like she had spent all morning at the copy shop. She plopped it down onto the president's folding chair as if she was presenting a sacred relic. With a dramatic flourish, she flipped it open and announced that it contained every critical piece of evidence necessary to prove her case. The HOA president tried to look interested, but mostly seemed overwhelmed by the avalanche of paperwork. The first page was a grainy photo of my house, taken at some odd angle, probably from Karen's upstairs window. She narrated every image, providing an exhaustive history of my downspouts and what she claimed were irregular water flow events. There were weather reports clipped from local news, annotated with highlighter, and a hand-drawn map that featured arrows in 6 different colors, showing what Karen insisted were the most likely routes of water through the neighborhood. She even included a printout of the city's rainfall statistics for the past 3 years, as if she had been collecting data since before I moved in. Every time the president tried to interject or suggest waiting for the city inspector, Karen would snap the binder shut and insist that the evidence is right here. She read aloud from her log of alleged violations, dates and times meticulously recorded in her tidy handwriting. There were also diagrams of the houses, showing where she believed my floodwater had breached community boundaries. One of the diagrams was labeled with the words, "Potential for catastrophic damage," circled several times in red pen. When she finally reached the end of her presentation, she looked up with a triumphant smile, clearly expecting applause. Instead, most people just stood quietly, shifting from foot to foot, unsure whether to laugh or just back away. The president offered a polite thank you and promised to review the material with the rest of the board. Karen's expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, stacking the binder with such care you'd think it contained the nation's secrets. She handed the president a USB drive as well, for further digital review, and then started collecting her pages, mumbling about how nobody appreciates documentation. As she marched off, her boots leaving squishy prints across my lawn, I realized this wasn't about water for her. It was about control, about being seen as the ultimate authority. My soaked basement was just her latest excuse. After Karen's marathon presentation, you'd think the neighborhood would get a break, but the opposite happened. That afternoon, A little parade of HOA board members began making rounds from house to house, each one holding a printed checklist that looked suspiciously similar to the diagrams in Karen's binder. They stopped at every gutter, peered over every fence, and tapped on every downspout like they were expecting a hidden message to reveal itself. Karen trailed along behind them, clipboard in hand, offering running commentary to anyone within earshot. The whole scene felt like the world's least entertaining block party. Neighbors watched from their windows as the board examined lawns and questioned everyone about their recent landscaping choices. A few brave souls ventured outside, only to find themselves cornered by Karen and her ever-present camera, who demanded statements for the official record. Her questions were so loaded and theatrical that it felt less like an interview and more like a courtroom drama being performed in real time. By late afternoon, the neighborhood group chat was alive with commentary. One neighbor joked that the HOA should give out gold medals for best gutter compliance, while another threatened to start selling tickets to the Inspection Olympics. Memes and jokes flew back and forth, but underneath the laughter was a growing sense of unease. It was clear that Karen was determined to turn this small flood into a crusade, and everyone was fair game. I stayed inside as long as I could, listening to the distant sound of Karen's voice rising and falling as she led her inspection team up and down the street. Eventually, they circled back to my place, their mood noticeably more somber after a long day of weathering Karen's enthusiasm. Karen launched into another lecture, pointing out imaginary violations on my property, including a suspicious puddle that turned out to be an old dog bowl left in the rain. The board members seemed exhausted, murmuring that they would follow up with official recommendations. Karen was already back on her phone, updating her followers and hinting at major developments in the water crisis. As the sun set, I watched her silhouette disappear around the corner, clipboard waving, already preparing her next act. The street felt less like a neighborhood and more like a reality show, and I couldn't help but wonder how many more episodes Karen had planned before the rest of us could finally change the channel. Early the next morning, 2 city trucks rolled down the street, their orange lights flashing as if signaling the arrival of actual help. Word traveled fast, and soon enough a small crowd gathered by the curb, eager for a new chapter in the saga. Karen greeted the city inspector and 2 plumbers like royalty, offering homemade muffins and a stack of printed complaints so thick you'd think she was lobbying Congress. She ushered them toward my property, launching into a well-rehearsed speech about ongoing negligence and irreversible damage to community value. The inspector listened politely, nodding at all the right moments, but his eyes kept wandering to the backyard. He spotted the oversized gutter extension on Karen's house almost immediately. Without a word, he motioned for the plumbers to follow and made his way to the fence. As soon as he stepped onto my grass, Karen moved in closer, camera ready, narrating every detail as though she had a personal audience. The plumbers didn't waste any time. They traced the flow of water with practiced ease, following the soggy trail from Karen's downspout straight to the channel she dug along the fence line. The inspector crouched by the trench, poked at the muddy soil, and frowned. "This isn't up to city code," he finally said, almost to himself. Karen's expression froze, then twisted into something between shock and indignation. She insisted the extension had been professionally installed, and that any issue must have resulted from my failure to maintain proper drainage on my side. The inspector, unfazed, explained that city code required all water runoff to be directed onto one's own property, not toward a neighbor's foundation. He pointed out that the extension had been altered since the original permit, and that the trench only made matters worse. The plumbers nodded in agreement, offering a few sympathetic looks in my direction. Karen argued that she had followed every known guideline, but her voice grew shrill as the inspector asked for documentation from her professional installer. She avoided eye contact, muttering about lost receipts and misunderstandings. With the evidence clear, the inspector wrote up a formal warning for Karen, instructing her to correct the drainage immediately or face a fine. As the city team packed up, Karen retreated into her house, her muffins untouched on the porch. The crowd slowly dispersed, some neighbors shaking their heads, others offering me silent support. For the first time since the flood started, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Karen's tidal wave of trouble was finally receding. After the city trucks pulled away, I stood by my fence watching the last puddles glisten in the morning sunday. I was exhausted but feeling lighter, almost convinced that the worst was over. That feeling lasted exactly 5 minutes. Karen re-emerged, no longer carrying muffins but instead wielding a binder and her favorite defense, denial. She called out across the yard, her voice sharp and accusing, In her mind, nothing had changed. The city inspector was wrong, the plumbers were mistaken, and the water was somehow still my responsibility. She paced the property line, launching into a half-hour lecture about proper water flow, quoting sections of the city code she had pulled up on her phone. She argued that her gutter extension was the result of environmental necessity and that redirecting runoff was a common practice. At one point, she waved her phone in my direction, declaring that she had done all the research and that I was simply trying to blame her for my own lack of preparation. Her husband, Rick, appeared briefly in the background, dragging a garden hose across their muddy patio and pretending not to hear a word of it. It would have been funny if I wasn't still mopping up water from my basement. I tried to reason with her, suggesting that maybe we could both get quotes from drainage specialists and share the cost of a proper fix. Karen scoffed at the idea, claiming she had already invested thousands in landscaping and would not pay twice for other people's problems. She pointed to the small trench she'd dug as evidence of her hard work, conveniently ignoring that it now looked like a tiny canal aimed directly at my house. As I stood there, Karen doubled down on her explanation, insisting that rainwater always ran that direction, even before her renovations. She promised to call her preferred contractor to verify everything, and to provide the HOA with a full report proving her innocence. I gave up arguing and returned inside, only to hear her continuing her speech for the benefit of any neighbor within earshot. Inside, I watched from the window as she gestured wildly, binder in one hand and phone in the other, determined to spin her story into something believable. The water in my basement was finally receding, but I had a sinking feeling that Karen's denial wasn't going anywhere. Later that afternoon, as I hauled waterlogged boxes up the stairs, there was a quiet knock at my door. It was Mrs. Ramirez from next door, holding a loaf of banana bread and giving me a sympathetic smile. "It's for the flood survivor," she said, her voice low. Before I could thank her, she glanced over her shoulder and whispered, "Don't worry, we all know what's really going on." She handed over the bread and nodded toward the street, where a few more neighbors were gathered, talking in small groups and occasionally glancing at Karen's house. I stepped outside for some fresh air, and to my surprise, people I barely knew began stopping by. Someone from down the block offered sandbags he still had left over from last year's storms. Another neighbor I'd only ever waved at handed me a pack of heavy-duty trash bags and said, "Hang in there." Even the kids on their bikes slowed down, wide-eyed, to ask if my basement had turned into a swimming pool. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had dealt with Karen's water issues. While we chatted, Mrs. Simmons from 2 doors down told me that her basement had flooded every spring for the past 4 years, and she suspected Karen's yard improvements were to blame. The Johnsons had similar complaints. One neighbor even joked that Karen's backyard looked like a moat every time it rained, but he'd never said anything because he didn't want to start trouble. As the stories piled up, it became clear that Karen's habit of redirecting water had been affecting people all up and down the street for years. Most just shrugged and cleaned up the mess, too tired to argue or unsure what good it would do to confront her. Now that someone was actually pushing back, it seemed the whole neighborhood was ready to tell their stories. While I stood in the driveway with my banana bread, the conversation grew lighter, jokes mixing with commiseration. Someone brought out folding chairs, and before long, it almost felt like an impromptu block party. The kids played tag on the sidewalk, the adults traded stories about Karen, and for the first time since the flood, I felt less alone in the mess. If nothing else, at least I'd gained a small army of banana bread-wielding allies, all united by the shared experience of surviving life next to Karen. That evening, as the sky faded from blue to a soft gray, my phone began buzzing with notifications. The neighborhood group chat was alive with activity, people sending updates, memes, and reactions to the day's events. It was a mix of sympathy, sarcasm, and dark humor, and for a few minutes, I almost forgot about the soggy smell lingering in my basement. Someone had already posted a photoshopped image of Karen standing on a pool float, wearing a crown and holding a garden hose like a scepter. The caption read, "Queen of the neighborhood, reigning over the flood zone." The comments section filled up fast. Neighbors chimed in with their own stories, and a running tally of how many times Karen had cited community values in the past 24 hours. Somehow, the group chat had become a place to vent frustration, but also to laugh at the absurdity of it all. A few people shared screenshots of Karen's posts on Nextdoor, where she continued her campaign to convince everyone that I was single-handedly responsible for the Great Flood. Her posts included elaborate diagrams and blurry photos, each one more dramatic than the last. Every so often, someone would reply with a meme or a witty comeback, and the whole thing would spiral into laughter again. Late into the evening, as I scrolled through the endless string of messages, I found myself actually relaxing for the first time in days. The group chat became its own kind of therapy. People who barely spoke at HOA meetings were now competing to come up with the best nickname for Karen's flood management plan. My favorite was Operation Duck Pond, suggested by Mr. Feldman, who usually only posted about lost cats. It was clear that no one was taking Karen's story at face value anymore. If anything, her determination to be the loudest voice in the room had finally made people notice how off-key she sounded. Between the jokes and the collective venting, I realized that the mood of the neighborhood had shifted. People were sharing their own grievances, swapping advice on everything from water damage to how to politely dodge Karen at the mailbox. My flooded basement was still a problem, but at least now it felt like a shared burden, something we could face together. As I put my phone down for the night, I couldn't help but feel a little lighter, grateful for the unexpected camaraderie that comes from weathering a storm with your neighbors, especially when the storm's name is Karen. The next morning brought a dull headache and a long list of chores, but there was no time to dwell on either. Before I'd even finished my coffee, a new notification popped up, an official warning from the city addressed to Karen, with a copy sent to me for documentation purposes. Reading the letter felt like a small victory. The city required her to fix her illegal drainage within 10 days or face a hefty fine. I stepped outside, letter in hand, and found Karen already in the driveway, on the phone, and waving her arms as she paced. Her voice carried across the street, full of indignation, as she recited her grievances to whoever was unlucky enough to answer her call this early. Word spread fast, as it always does. Neighbors passed by, some slowing down to offer a grin or a knowing nod. A few couldn't resist tossing out hopeful predictions about Karen's next move. Inside the group chat, the news of the city warning was cause for celebration. Someone posted a screenshot of the letter, complete with a parade of party emojis. Another neighbor posted a gif of someone popping champagne. Karen's response was pure escalation. Within the hour, she started telling anyone who would listen that I must have bribed the city inspector. According to her, no ordinary person could get the city to respond so quickly, and certainly not against someone with her community standing. She posted online about suspicious collusion and tried to rally support for a petition demanding a re-inspection. By lunchtime, Rick, her long-suffering husband, caught me at the mailbox. He kept his voice low and eyes on the ground. "Just do what you need to do," he said, handing me an envelope full of old plumber business cards and quietly admitting he thought Karen was losing it. He muttered something about finally getting a decent night's sleep once this was all over, then hurried away before Karen could spot him. For the rest of the day, Karen paraded up and down the street, glaring at anyone who dared to make eye contact. She stopped in front of my house several times, pausing for dramatic effect before snapping more photos of my yard. Each time, I wondered if she was documenting the exact location of every blade of grass, or just making sure everyone knew she wasn't backing down. The standoff had moved beyond water. Now it was about pride, and the story she wanted to tell, no matter how far from reality it drifted. About a week later, the repair trucks began lining the curb, engines humming and toolboxes clattering as a small crew prepared to start work on my flooded basement. Insurance adjusters arrived, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of every damp wall and swollen floorboard. The plumbers returned, this time with extra help and a sense of determination that only comes from having already been blamed on social media by a local Karen. They set up pumps, traced pipes, and carefully examined every inch of the property line. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and sawdust. It didn't take long for them to discover something odd just beneath the surface of the backyard, right where Karen's gutter extension met the old fence. The lead plumber called me over, his boots sinking into the mud. He pointed to a section of pipe that looked out of place, an old sewer main that had been capped off years ago when the city upgraded the block's infrastructure. This ancient pipe ran right beneath the property line, forgotten by most, but not by Karen. With a gloved hand, the plumber revealed a series of new connections running from Karen's downspout and sump pump, both funneling runoff directly into this abandoned sewer main. Every time her sump pump kicked on or rainwater overflowed from her gutters, it traveled through the pipe, straight under my yard, and found the path of least resistance into my basement. The plumbers exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them that this was one of the worst, repurposed plumbing jobs they'd seen. I took photos, documented every angle, and sent the evidence to the city inspector. The adjuster shook his head and muttered that he'd never seen someone reroute household water into a capped main just to avoid backyard puddles. It became clear that Karen's idea of efficient water management involved sending her problems underground, literally and figuratively. When Karen came outside and spotted the crew digging near the fence, she stormed over, phone at the ready, demanding to know why strangers were trespassing. The plumbers calmly explained what they'd found, and for a split second, even Karen looked rattled. She recovered quickly, though, blaming the previous owners and swearing she had no idea about the connections. As she stormed back to her house, the reality set in for everyone watching. This mess wasn't just a flood. It was a masterclass in avoidance, and now, with the evidence unearthed, Karen's excuses were running out just as quickly as the water once had. After the plumbers uncovered Karen's backyard handiwork, the mood on our block shifted again. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Word spread quickly, and it wasn't long before a copy of the photos made its way into the group chat, followed by a wave of disbelief and the digital equivalent of popcorn emojis. The city inspector responded within a day, this time with paperwork in hand. He handed me a copy of a cease and desist order drafted for Karen, citing illegal connections to city infrastructure and outlining the necessary steps to correct the problem. Following the inspector's visit, I drafted a letter of my own and slid it under Karen's door. It was a formal request for her to stop all drainage activity that directed water onto my property. I even attached a copy of the inspector's findings and a friendly reminder that further damage would mean legal action. Karen's response was not friendly. By that afternoon, she had written a note on pink stationery and taped it to my front door. She accused me of defamation by basement and warned that her lawyer would be in touch. From that moment on, she parked her SUV at the very edge of my driveway, blocking access just enough to send a message but not enough for the city to ticket her. She stood outside in the mornings, arms folded, staring down anyone who dared glance in our direction. The old group chat filled with jokes about the standoff at the OK driveway, but nobody actually wanted to get caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, the plumber's report and city warning made it official. Karen was not just a difficult neighbor, she was now facing real consequences. She doubled down, snapping photos of everything from my trash cans to my front steps, building her own file of alleged grievances. Anytime a neighbor passed, she warned them about malicious lawsuits and neighborhood traitors. I tried to keep things calm, focusing on the repairs and letting the paperwork speak for itself. The whole situation felt surreal, like living in an episode of a reality show where no one gets voted off. They just keep coming back with new accusations. The cease and desist had started as a plea for peace, but Karen had turned it into a new battlefield. Every morning, her car loomed at the edge of my driveway, a daily reminder that, for some people, losing an argument is worse than any flood. A few days after the cease and desist showdown, the city returned with a verdict. Karen received an official letter from the municipal code office, outlining the fines she faced if she did not repair the illegal drainage within 1 week. The letter was unambiguous. Failure to comply would mean daily penalties and a mandatory inspection after the repairs. As soon as the city worker drove away, Karen was already on the phone. Her voice was frantic, her steps quick and uneven as she paced her driveway, waving the notice in the air for all to see. That afternoon, she knocked on my door for the first time since the whole mess began. Her tone was sharp, her words clipped, but beneath the bluster I could see the fear in her eyes. She thrust the letter at me and demanded that I take the blame for the drainage issue, suggesting that if I admitted fault, the city might let her off with a warning. She insisted that I owed it to the neighborhood to keep its reputation clean, and if I refused, everyone's property values would drop. I stood in the doorway, listening as she bounced between pleading and threatening, desperate to avoid the fines she now faced. For a moment, I saw a crack in her armor. This wasn't just about water or pride anymore, it was about the fear of losing control. She admitted, almost in a whisper, that she could not afford the city's penalties, and that Rick was at the end of his rope. The usually unflappable Karen looked small, and for the briefest second, I almost felt sorry for her. But the flood in my basement, the sleepless nights, and the parade of plumbers were still too fresh. I told her I could not take the blame for something that was not my fault, especially with all the evidence in plain sight. Her mood changed instantly, her shoulders squared, and she warned that if I did not do the right thing, things would get ugly. Then she marched back to her house, slamming the door hard enough to make the porch shake. Neighbors watched the whole exchange through their blinds, texting me soon after with a mix of encouragement and disbelief. Even Rick sent a quick message, apologizing for the trouble and promising that he was trying to talk some sense into her. The city's letter had pushed Karen to the brink, and it was clear that the next move was going to be hers. After Karen's visit, I knew waiting and hoping for the best was a waste of time. I spent the evening going over every document, email, and city report I'd collected since the flood began. It was all there in black and white, clear proof of where the water started, where it went, and who made it everyone else's problem. Still, paperwork wasn't going to solve a neighbor like Karen. That's when I remembered Greg, a friend from down the street who worked for the city's engineering department. He'd stopped by during the first days of the chaos, quietly offering help if I ever needed it. I called Greg that night and gave him the full rundown. He listened without interrupting, only asking a question when something didn't add up. When I finished, he let out a low whistle and promised to come by the next afternoon. True to his word, Greg showed up right after work, city badge clipped to his belt and a stack of blueprints tucked under his arm. We sat at my kitchen table, spreading out the maps of the sewer lines, storm drains, and property boundaries. Greg pointed to the capped sewer main running under our yards and nodded toward Karen's house. If she wants to play games with water, she's about to see how quickly things can change. Greg explained that the city would be sending a maintenance crew to inspect and, if necessary, reroute the illegal drainage system. He assured me the city had every right to cap the main on Karen's side, redirecting her runoff back toward her own property. It was legal, practical, and absolutely fair. He also advised that I continue documenting everything, especially any new attempts by Karen to manipulate the system or blame someone else. The city's patience for this stuff is wearing thin, he said, tapping one of the blueprints for emphasis. I could feel the stress easing as we talked. It wasn't about revenge, Greg reminded me, but about restoring the balance. Everyone deserved a dry basement and a fair shot at living in peace. The plan was simple, backed by city code, and, best of all, it didn't rely on out-arguing Karen. As Greg packed up his things, he gave me a reassuring nod. Just let us handle it. If she wants a water war, we'll give her the city's version of justice. For the first time since the flooding started, I felt like I had real backup. The next 2 days brought a tense kind of quiet to the street, the kind that makes everyone a little uneasy. Karen kept to herself, though her blinds twitched every time someone passed by her house. I took Greg's advice and documented every corner of my yard and basement, snapping photos of lingering puddles and any new signs of water intrusion. I spoke with neighbors, collecting written statements from those who had dealt with the same runoff issues. Each story sounded familiar, a slow trickle at first, then a surprise flood when the storms came. Even with evidence on my side, it was hard not to feel the pressure building. Karen's silence was unnatural. She was rarely out of sight or out of the conversation for more than an hour, and now she barely left her porch. I saw her once, standing in the backyard with her phone pointed at the fence, filming the city's marker flags and mumbling to herself. Rick did his best to keep up appearances, watering the lawn and waving at neighbors as if everything was fine. The rest of the block seemed to sense something was brewing. A few people made excuses to check their mail or walk their dogs past my house, offering updates and quiet encouragement. Someone left a stack of legal forms in my mailbox, unsigned but helpful, just in case. For the first time, I realized how invested everyone had become. The water had brought us together, whether we liked it or not, and Karen's drama had started to wear thin. Late on the second evening, I sat by my living room window and watched as a city crew van rolled to a stop near the curb. The workers got out quietly, setting up a line of orange cones and checking blueprints under the glow of a street lamp. Greg was there, hard hat and clipboard in hand, nodding at me when our eyes met through the window. He gave a thumbs up, as if to say, "We've got this." The house felt calmer that night. I finally slept without listening for the drip of water or Karen's voice outside. The neighborhood waited in the hush, all of us wondering what the next day would bring and hoping, just maybe, that it would be the start of something different, a return to peace, or at the very least, a dry basement. The morning of the city crew's work, the street woke early. Neighbors stepped onto their porches with coffee mugs, pretending not to stare while the orange cones and safety vests formed a neat barrier around the edge of Karen's property. Greg led the team, walking the perimeter and checking off details on his clipboard. There was a buzz of quiet anticipation as the workers pulled up sod, exposing the capped sewer main where Karen's pipes connected. Karen appeared at her window, face pressed to the glass, her phone already recording. She darted outside in her slippers and robe, trying to ask the crew questions, but Greg calmly explained that they were conducting emergency maintenance. She tried to protest, insisting there was no emergency, and demanding to know why the city would listen to false reports. Greg stayed polite, repeating that the crew had work to do and that interfering would only slow things down. The crew worked steadily, first disconnecting the illegal gutter extension, then carefully inspecting the sump pump line. They removed Karen's connections from the capped sewer main, rerouting her runoff onto her own lawn as the code required. The whole process took hours, and with every shovel of dirt and turn of a wrench, Karen's frustration grew. She paced the edge of the cones, recording video and narrating her complaints for anyone willing to listen. The real drama started when water began to pool near her foundation, unable to escape the way it had before. Karen shouted at the crew, accusing them of sabotage and threatening to call the mayor. Greg reminded her that the work had been ordered by the city and explained, calmly, that the only way to avoid flooding was to direct water safely onto her own property. The neighbors watched as the truth became visible. Her improvements had only hidden the problem, not solved it. By the time the city crew packed up their tools and rolled away, Karen's yard looked like a soggy maze. The trench that once channeled water under my house now filled with runoff right at her doorstep. Rick dragged out a stack of towels and started sopping up the puddles as Karen paced, still filming, trying to salvage her side of the story. I stood at my fence, feeling equal parts relief and disbelief. After months of chaos, the water war had finally come home to roost. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the first shouts came echoing across the street. Karen's voice rang out, loud enough to make every neighbor pause mid-conversation or freeze in their driveway. It was a raw, panicked sound, the kind that cut through the normal background noise and made people glance at their windows. She was yelling for Rick, calling for buckets, and demanding someone do something about the water rising in her living room. From my porch, I could see the chaos unfolding in real time. Rick rushed out the front door carrying towels, slipping on the muddy walkway. Karen darted from window to window, her phone in one hand, frantically narrating her disaster as it unfolded. "This is criminal negligence," she cried to her online audience, panning her camera from the soggy carpet to the city crew's handiwork outside. She pleaded for help from the HOA, from the city, from anyone who would listen, growing more desperate each time she failed to stop the spreading water. Within minutes, curious neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, trying not to look too interested but clearly fascinated. The group chat lit up again, this time with updates and play-by-play descriptions of Karen's indoor pool. Even the HOA president stopped by to see the aftermath, quietly taking photos for insurance purposes, while Karen shrieked at him for not protecting her property. I stood at the edge of my yard, feeling a mix of vindication and sympathy. I remembered how quickly things had spiraled for me not so long ago, and how helpless I had felt as the water crept up the basement walls. But this time, there was nothing I could do. The city had fixed the issue. Karen's problems were now contained to her own home, exactly as the code intended. Rick worked in silence, wringing out towels and dumping buckets of water onto the front steps. Karen continued her campaign, now streaming live on every platform she could, desperate to shift the blame before the last bit of daylight disappeared. The rest of us simply watched, the neighborhood united by something new: relief, maybe, or just the knowledge that the storm had finally changed direction. By the next morning, news of Karen's flooded living room had traveled far beyond our block. Clips from her late-night live stream were already circulating through the group chat, sparking a new round of commentary and laughter. Someone had spliced together a highlight reel of her most dramatic moments, complete with subtitles and slow-motion effects. It took less than an hour for the video to rack up dozens of likes and comments, most from neighbors who had quietly endured her antics for years. Karen, undeterred by her soggy carpet and ruined furniture, doubled down on her quest for sympathy. She posted frantic updates on every social media platform, tagging the city, the HOA, and even the local news channel. Her posts described a targeted campaign of harassment and insisted that she was the true victim. She included photos of the water damage, close-ups of her ruined rugs, and teary-eyed selfies captioned with pleas for justice. Each post drew more responses, but not the ones she hoped for. Instead of rallying support, people replied with memes, jokes, and reminders of the countless times she had redirected her own water problems onto everyone else. Even the few neighbors who usually stayed neutral began to weigh in. Some shared screenshots of city code, highlighting the rules Karen had ignored. Others posted before and after photos of their own basements, making it clear that her improvements had never really helped anyone but herself. The block's unofficial historian dug up old group chat debates, sharing messages where Karen had bragged about her creative drainage system. By mid-afternoon, Karen's online campaign took a strange turn. She began blaming a rotating cast of villains, from me to the city inspector to mysterious internet trolls. She claimed the city crew had sabotaged her foundation on purpose and accused neighbors of conspiring to destroy her reputation. Each new accusation was met with a fresh wave of disbelief, and the memes grew more creative with every update. I kept my head down, replying only when someone asked for a factual timeline or forwarded a new photo. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, I felt no urge to defend myself. The truth was out in the open, and the neighborhood seemed content to let Karen's own words tell the story. As evening approached, the buzz faded, and the block returned to its usual rhythms. Karen's disaster had gone viral, but so had the long-overdue truth. As the week wore on, Karen's house became the talk of the neighborhood. The city's warning had turned into a full-blown citation, with daily fines stacking up each time the drainage issue remained unresolved. Inspectors came and went, snapping photos, measuring runoff, and leaving fresh notices taped to her door. Each new visit seemed to push Karen further into a state of indignation, her front windows crowded with signs blaming everyone from the HOA board to unsupportive neighbors for her predicament. The HOA, feeling the pressure, called a special meeting in the community center to address recent water management concerns. This time, the room was packed. People who usually skip these gatherings filled every seat, eager for answers and maybe a little entertainment. Karen arrived late, dragging a rolling suitcase stuffed with documents and folders. She sat up in the front row and immediately began passing out copies of her evidence packet, urging everyone to read her side of the story. The meeting started with the HOA president giving a measured summary of the events. He outlined the city's findings, the timeline of repairs, and the impact on the surrounding homes. Karen interrupted repeatedly, insisting that the board was misrepresenting her actions. She pointed to her stack of paperwork, demanding the floor, and read a prepared statement about her years of service and her ongoing fight for fair treatment. The board let her speak, but the mood in the room was tense. Neighbors exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes, others quietly scrolling through Karen memes on their phones. After Karen finished, several residents raised their hands. One by one, people shared their own experiences with the flooding, describing years of ruined basements, lost property, and mounting frustration. For the first time, voices of the neighborhood outnumbered Karen's. Someone read aloud a section of city code, others presented photos of the old trench and gutter extension, and one brave soul even pulled up the viral video from Karen's live stream to underscore the absurdity of her claims. In the end, the board sided with the majority, voting to uphold the fines and demanding that Karen pay for damages to the affected homes. Karen stormed out, leaving behind her suitcase and a room full of neighbors who finally felt heard. The sense of relief was almost tangible. The meeting had given everyone a chance to speak, and now, for the first time in ages, the neighborhood was united in something besides disaster. The weekend after the meeting, a kind of hopeful energy returned to the block. The rain had passed and, for the first time in weeks, the air felt light. Early Saturday morning, neighbors gathered in front of my house with rakes, mops, and trash bags, ready to help clean up the mess left behind by the flood. Some brought donuts or coffee, others brought their kids, and together we formed an improvised cleanup crew, laughing and trading stories as we worked. People hauled waterlogged furniture out to the curb and set up fans in the basement to dry out the last of the moisture. Kids swept muddy leaves from the walkway and chased each other with squirt guns. Even the HOA president showed up in jeans and old sneakers, rolling up his sleeves to help scrape mud from the garage floor. It was the first time I'd seen him laugh since this all started. As the morning turned to afternoon, Rick wandered over carrying a pizza box and a sheepish grin. He handed out slices, thanked everyone for their support, and admitted that it had been a rough couple of weeks at home. Karen, notably absent, kept her blinds drawn, her car parked deep in the garage. There were no more parades of photos or sidewalk accusations. She seemed to have retreated from public life, at least for now. With every trip up the stairs, arms loaded with salvaged boxes or drenched towels, I felt a little more grateful. Not for the flood itself, but for what came after: the camaraderie, the sense of shared victory, and the simple relief of not facing it all alone. As the last of the mess disappeared, and the sun came out from behind the clouds, someone suggested a barbecue the following weekend to celebrate the return to normal. Neighbors hung around long after the work was done, lingering on front steps and swapping stories about everything from leaky roofs to the best pizza toppings. Even the kids, sticky with popsicle juice, seemed happier, their laughter carrying down the block. For the first time in a long while, the street felt like a neighborhood again, the shadow of the flood finally receding, replaced by the unmistakable promise of better days ahead. Despite the relief that swept over the neighborhood, Karen refused to go quietly. She re-emerged the next week with renewed determination, brandishing a stack of legal papers and vowing to set the record straight. She stormed up and down the sidewalk, stopping anyone who would listen to warn of upcoming lawsuits and slander charges. Her voice carried, echoing from porch to porch, but few neighbors seemed interested in reigniting the feud. Most had moved on, content to rebuild and enjoy the peace that had finally settled over the street. Still, Karen did everything she could to stay in the spotlight. She sent lengthy emails to the HOA board, copied to the entire neighborhood, insisting on a formal apology and compensation for what she described as irreparable harm. Each message read like a manifesto, packed with legal jargon and dramatic flourishes. She even called a few local news stations, but when reporters arrived and heard both sides, no one was interested in telling a story that had already played out online. Karen's final gambit came in the form of a social media blitz. She posted lengthy video rants about her ordeal, tagging community leaders, city officials, and anyone she thought could help her reclaim her narrative. The response, though, was not what she expected. The plumber who had uncovered her backyard drainage scheme posted the capped sewer main footage to TikTok, where it quickly went viral. Comments flooded in from strangers across the city, most siding with the block and mocking Karen's creative plumbing. The memes grew wilder by the day. One popular video featured a dramatic reenactment of Karen's waterworks, complete with rubber ducks and toy boats. Others remixed clips from her live stream into musical parodies, and a few even turned the entire saga into a running joke about flood season on our street. The block watched the spectacle unfold, part amused, part amazed that their local drama had become a citywide punchline. Through it all, Karen kept pushing her version of events, but her audience had shrunk. People tuned out her rants and stopped replying to her emails. As summer crept in, her voice faded into the background, drowned out by the sound of sprinklers, laughter, and the quiet relief of normalcy returning. The water had receded, and now, so had Karen's reign. By the time June arrived, Karen's name had become a punchline in the group chat and a distant memory at block gatherings. The TikTok video posted by the plumber had reached thousands of views, drawing attention from far beyond our quiet neighborhood. Even the local news station ran a quick segment about sewer main Karen, pairing footage of rubber ducks with a lighthearted warning about following city codes. For the first time in years, our street had something to laugh about that didn't end with a complaint. The energy at HOA meetings shifted as well. Now, whenever someone brought up a problem, the phrase, "at least it's not another flood," was guaranteed to get a round of chuckles. Karen's infamous livestream was referenced in every joke, and the image of her pacing the lawn in slippers, waving her phone and demanding justice, became an inside reference everyone understood. The memes never stopped. At the next neighborhood barbecue, someone brought a cake decorated like a blue river, with tiny toy ducks swimming across the icing. Laughter came easy, and even the kids got in on the fun, staging their own reenactment of the Great Karen Flood with squirt guns and toy boats. As the days warmed and the lawns recovered, Karen herself faded further from view. She stopped posting online and withdrew from the usual circles, her windows shuttered against the noise of the block. Some wondered if she might try one last comeback, but she never did. The neighborhood settled into a comfortable routine, and new stories began to replace the old. The couple next door adopted a rescue dog, someone started a garden club, and the only thing people fought about now was whose turn it was to bring snacks to the HOA meeting. Every so often, a new neighbor would move in, and someone would quietly warn them, "If you hear stories about the flood, just ask for the TikTok link." The legend of sewer main Karen became less of a sore spot and more of a quirky badge of honor, something everyone had survived together. It was a reminder that, even after the most absurd disasters, laughter and community could make things whole again. Life on the street carried on, a little wiser, a lot closer, and always ready for the next wild tale to come rolling down the block. 6 months later, The changes on our street were impossible to ignore. The lawns had grown lush again, dotted with flowers instead of puddles, and every basement was dry for the first time in years. The memory of the flood still lingered, but it had transformed into a kind of folklore, a shared experience that connected everyone in unexpected ways. The block parties were livelier, the group chat friendlier, and people stopped to talk in driveways instead of rushing inside. Karen's house was quieter than ever. The blinds stayed shut, the garden slowly overtaken by weeds. Her car disappeared for days at a time, and rumors began to spread that she was thinking of selling. One afternoon, a moving truck appeared outside, and by nightfall, Karen was gone. She didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, and no one saw her loading boxes. By sunrise, a "for sale" sign stood in the yard, and the street exhaled as if a long-held breath had finally been released. When the new owners moved in, everyone watched with cautious optimism. It turned out they were a young couple, both plumbers, drawn to the house by its unique water features and the promise of a fresh start. They introduced themselves to the neighbors with warm smiles, joked about setting up a basement scuba class, and hosted a small barbecue to meet everyone. Within a week, the house felt alive again, windows thrown open, laughter spilling onto the porch, music drifting out on summer evenings. The change was unmistakable. The street that had once tiptoed around one neighbor's moods now welcomed everyone with open arms. Problems still came up. Of course, a broken fence here, a stray dog there, but people faced them together. There was no more fear of angry emails, no more drama at the mailbox. The worst days had passed, and the neighborhood had weathered them, stronger for it. On the anniversary of the flood, someone dropped off banana bread at every doorstep, a quiet nod to how it all began. The gesture was met with smiles, jokes, and a few happy tears. The flood was over, but the sense of belonging it left behind stayed. Looking down the street at dusk, with porch lights glowing and kids riding bikes, it was hard to imagine that a single neighbor could ever cause so much trouble again. The story had ended, but the neighborhood together had finally found peace. And there you have it, the day a suburban water war turned into a cautionary tale for every Karen with a hose and a grudge. If you've made it this far without checking your pipes for sabotage, congratulations, you're braver than me. Honestly, there's nothing quite like watching someone try to weaponize community rules and end up flooding their own life literally. So next time your neighbor tries to give you a lecture about grass height or accuses you of illegal tomato watering, remember, the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes karma arrives with a side of raw sewage. Hit that subscribe button if you love stories where the bad guy's living room ends up on the wrong side of the sewer main. Drop a comment if you've ever faced down a local tyrant. Trust me, sharing is cheaper than therapy. And if you're listening, Karen, maybe try sticking to indoor plants from now on. The rest of us? We'll be over here, enjoying dry basements and fresh air while you're figuring out how to get that smell out of your carpet. Until next time, may your neighbors be reasonable, your pipes be strong, and your HOA meetings mercifully brief. Stay dry out there.